Welcome back to the Prajna series by Nasin Palasmudram. In this segment, we continue our journey into the fundamentals of GST returns. Shri Rajesh V. George, Assistant Director, will guide us through a key area in the GST framework, the concept of time of supply and the various documents that play a crucial role in the GSTR1 filling process.
My usage of this PPT, I'm not going to focus too much on the PPT that is there. We focus on, I try to build a particular logic with reference to the GSTR1, the tables that are there in the GSTR1, and how the data from these tables will flow into the 2A, 2B, 3B. That is what is the purpose of today's session. Now, with this understanding of the GSTR1 that is there, okay, the final thing that I just want to highlight with reference to the GSTR1 is, I want you to remember this aspect which is called as first return. There is section 40 which tells you first returns. I will come back to it when I explain another concept, but I just want you to remember that or keep it in the back of your mind that there is something called as a first return in GST also. Section 40 of the CGST Act. Now, with this background, I just want to touch upon now, instead of looking at the PPT, I want to use the board to make you understand as to whether we are able to understand what are the various tables and the various forms that are there in GST. So that is what we do in the next part of the session. Pause for a moment. If I were to ask you, now I did explain to you what is there in your GSTR1. You understood section 37 tells you, who needs to file, what is the periodicity, what is the due date, is there a possibility of amendment, is there a situation where the GSTR1 system does not allow you to file, or if I do something wrong in my GSTR1, can my registration be cancelled? I told you about all these things, correct? Now, if I were to ask you now, with this background in mind, if I were to ask you, what do you think is actually there in the GSTR1? Now, I would have actually loved to have an audience where, I can interact with the audience, but I'm in a studio, so I have to tell you what is actually there in the GSTR1. Now, many a times, let me tell you, the responses that I get from the audience that, what is there actually there in the GSTR1. I actually get this response saying that, the details of outward supply. GSTR1 is nothing but the details of outward supply. But what is actually reflected in the GSTR1? What is actually reflected in the GSTR1? People will tell me, details of B2B supplies, B2C supplies, you have these exempt supply details, you have the invoice details that you need to put down and all those sort of things. Actually, many will tell you that, this is what is actually there in the GSTR1. But let me give you a moment to pause and think, and let me make a statement, and then you can think over what I say is actually there in the GSTR1. What is actually there in the GSTR1 is nothing but the data pertaining to the documents. The data pertaining to the documents that have been issued, raised or generated during a particular tax period. What do I mean by that? If I'm going to file a GSTR1 for April 2025, the data pertaining to the documents that were generated or issued or raised during April 2025, the data pertaining to those documents is what is reflected in the GSTR1. So it is not that the documents get reflected in the GSTR1, it is definitely the documents pertaining to the outward supplies that actually gets the data pertaining to the documents of these outward supplies which actually needs to be reflected in the GSTR1. Now, every time when we find that, these concepts are like, the various tables to remember are a little challenging, I want you to always remember that, 1.28 crore taxpayer needs to do this on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. They need to be aware as to what all is to be done. It should be reflected in the GSTR1. So I told you that what is actually there in the GSTR1 is nothing but the data pertaining to the documents that have been issued, generated or raised during a particular tax period. So the example I told you was in April 2025, whatever is the documents that have been generated during April 2025, the data pertaining to those documents I need to reflect in my GSTR1 for April 2025. So the first question or the first aspect that I need to actually make you understand is the fact that, what are the documents that are there in GST? What are the documents that are there in GST is an essential understanding for you to understand what is the data pertaining to these documents that needs to be reflected in the GSTR1. Now, if I were to ask you what are the documents that are actually there in GST, I'm sure all of you will tell me that there is one of the documents which commonly comes to your mind will be an invoice, a credit note, a debit note, a delivery challan. These are the various documents that very frequently or everybody is aware of. It comes to your mind. But is it only these 3 or 4 documents that are possible in GST? Now, that is what I'm going to try to explain this on this particular screen here, trying to make you understand what are the possible documents that are there in GST. Now, if I were to tell you the various documents are invoice, debit note, credit note, delivery challan, or a refund voucher, or a receipt voucher, or a payment voucher, or a self-generated invoice, or an ISD invoice, you may not get the entire flow. Correct? Like I told you about using an acronym to get this particular understanding or the memory that is there in place, I would request you to actually now focus on, I just want to introduce, I'm going to use 2 concepts that are there in GST. Try to make you understand with these 2 concepts that are there in GST. First one is, what are the various documents that are there in GST? The second is that, how do these data pertaining to these documents get reflected in the GSTR1? So, the first concept that I want to make you understand is a concept which is called as time of supply. Now, if I were to ask you, I'm sure again I would have loved to have an audience and ask you what is the time of supply, but I have that particular constraint of not asking you what is the time of supply. I would rather tell you what is time of supply. I'm not going to go too much into this time of supply. I just want to take one ingredient from this provision of time of supply to make you understand what are the documents that are there in GST. That is my purpose. Time of supply is first of all covered under Section 12, Section 13 of the CGST Act. You want to read more about time of supply, you will go to this particular provision. Now that means time of supply under Section 12 is with reference to supply of goods. Time of supply with reference to services is covered under Section 13. What does time of supply means? It means the point in time or the period in time when the taxpayer needs to pay his taxes in respect of a particular supply. Let me just make you understand this with an example. Say I want to supply 100 numbers of this particular pen is there, and I want to supply it to my friend only. The only friend that I have here is Chandrakant. So the person to whom I want to supply is, I want to make a supply of 100 numbers of this pen. I am based in Karnataka and I want to supply this to Chandrakant, who is based in Tamil Nadu. This is the situation. Let me give you the scenarios that is possible. I told you that we will try to build a logic. We will try to build a logic based on the general awareness that we have. So if I want to make a supply of this particular 100 numbers of this pen, I need to issue a particular document. I'm sure that all of you agree with that particular fact. So let us say that I issue an invoice number 1, which is dated 1/4/2025. I issue an invoice dated 1/4/2025. Now it so happens that now this is a pen, which is a goods. Okay, this is a goods. I want you to visualize this is a goods. I will try to make you understand the difference between a time of supply with reference to goods and a time of supply with reference to services. Now, it so happened that though I issued the invoice on 1/4/2025, Chandrakant had requested that, I want it very urgently on the evening of 31/3/2025. He asked for me for the material on 31/3/2025. So what I did, I made the supply on 31/3/2025 to Chandrakant in Tamil Nadu on 31/3/2025. But there was time constraint or whatever reason. I'm just trying to build a situation. I'm not trying to tell you whether it is right, wrong, or anything like that. I'm trying to make you understand that these are things that can happen or may happen, or now we need to understand whether the law permits that. So now here is where the question comes is, Chandrakant wanted this urgently at 10 o'clock in the night. So what I did is I found a particular person to supply it. I supplied it on 31/3/2025. Now, after I made this particular supply, it so happens that, I did not have the time to generate an invoice. So what I do is, I come back on 1st of April 2025, I generate an invoice on 1st of April 25. Again, does not trying to tell you whether it is right or wrong. I'm just trying to build a logic to this. Now, when Chandrakant suddenly wants this particular supply of this 100 numbers of pen, I am a very cautious supplier. I do not know whether Chandrakant is going to pay me for this particular one. So what I tell Chandrakant is, now Chandrakant, you want this money, you want this particular supply of 100 numbers immediately, you need to give me an advance. You need to give me 50% of this, whatever is the cost of this. Let's say it is 1 lakh rupees. If it is 1 lakh rupees, you need to give me 50,000 rupees. You need to give me 50,000 rupees immediately. Only then I'm going to supply this to you. So So what does Chandrakant do? Now Chandrakant makes this advance payment on 31/3/2025. He makes the advance payment on 31/3/2025. Now the question that comes up here with reference to the time of supply is, the supply happened on a particular date, the invoice is generated on a subsequent date, and the third one is there is a payment received on a particular date. So there are these different scenarios that are possible. Or if I want to just make it a little more fun, I can say that the advance he gave it to me on 28/2/2025. Now the question of urgency does not arise, but make it as let's try to understand this. So in the month of February 28/2/2025, Chandrakant gives me an advance of 50,000 rupees. Chandrakant gives me an advance of 50,000 rupees. I supply it on 31/3/2025, but I raise the invoice on 1/4/2025. As I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to tell you is the fact that we use the concept of time of supply. So in this particular example that is there is that what is the period, when do I need to pay the tax in respect of this particular supply? Supplied on 31/3/2025, invoice generated on 1/4/2025, advance received on 28/2/2025. That is what we see on the screen here. Now I'm not going to tell you what is right or what is not. So this is what time of supply means. Now similarly, you have to visualize this particular scenario. This is for goods. If it were now, like for example, I've already supplied this 100 numbers of this pen, but this pen had to be repaired. I do repair service of this particular one. So if this particular scenario that is there on this one is, the invoice is generated on 1/4/2025, the service happened on 31/3/2025, the advance was received documents that are there in GST, rather than thinking that there is an invoice, there is a credit note, there is a debit note, or there is a delivery challan, or a refund voucher, or receipt voucher, try to relate to those various documents that are there with reference to this particular two aspects. That is the date of issue of invoice or the date of receipt of payment. When I say date of issue of invoice, now the first question is, instead of making this date of issue, I will just say invoice and payment. So wherever only I'm just trying to bring only these two components out of this time of supply is one. Now the first question that comes up is, when you say invoice, now is there a due date for issue of an invoice? You remember the example that I told you, supply happened on 31/3/2025, invoice on 1/4/2025. So the aspect that you need to first understand is there a due date for issue of an invoice? Now, if you say there is a due date, there is a next question that you need to answer is that if the due date for issue of invoice with reference to supply of goods is the same as the due date for issue of invoice for the supply of services, or is it different? Now, let's try to understand from this fundamental aspect, is there a due date for issue of invoice with reference to supply of goods? Now, section 31(1). Ultimately, I am trying to make you understand that along with the general awareness, we build a logic, we build an understanding. It has to match with whatever is the provision of the law that is there. So that is why I am trying to highlight the section where it is specified. Section 31(1) of the CGST Act will tell you that an invoice in respect of supply of goods is to be done before or at the time of removal when there is a movement of goods. What do you mean? The goods in that particular example that I highlighted to you actually was moved on 31/3/2025. So the invoice needs to be issued before 31/3/2025 or on 31/3/2025. So Rajesh issuing the invoice on 1/4/2025 in respect of supply of goods is incorrect as per section 31(1). So what does it say? Before or at the time of removal, an invoice needs to be issued. Now go back to that particular example with reference to supply of services. The service was supplied or the service was provided on 31/3. Invoice was issued on 1/4. Correct? Now, section 31(2) will tell you that the invoice can be issued in the normal, in respect of most of the services, within 30 days of provision of service. That is, in the example that was there, if the provision of service happened on 31/3/2025, the invoice can be issued within 30 days from 31/3/2025. That is, let us say 29th of April. Within 29th of April, the invoice needs to be issued in respect of all services, except in respect of financial, that is, there is a banking service or a financial institution, or I think for a telecom service, for a banking, financial institution, banking, insurance, and for telecom. In respect of this, the due date for issue of an invoice is 45 days. Is 45 days from the date of provision of service. That is, in respect of that particular example that I gave you, if it was 31/3/2025 when the service was actually rendered, within 45 days from 31/3/2025, that is 14th of May 2025, the invoice can be issued. Now 31(1) and 31(2) gives you the timelines within which the invoice in respect of supply of goods and the supply of service needs to be issued. Now one invoice has been issued. So I'm just going to remove this particular due date that is there. Now there is a particular time limit that is there. There is an invoice for supply of goods. We have understood the invoice with reference to supply of service also. There is a due date for both. Now in the example that I gave you that invoice was issued, invoice was actually dated 1/4/2025. Now visualize the various scenarios that are possible. The various scenarios that are possible is, let me try to explain with reference to the taxable value and the tax that is there in the invoice. Let me try to make you understand this one. Now I told you that the particular value of that particular supply was 1 lakh rupees. 1 lakh rupees is the value of supply, one. Now what happens is, the person who is actually issuing the invoice Is it possible for him to make a mistake? It is very much possible. Now what he has done is, instead of showing 1 lakh rupees, he showed it as 10 lakh rupees. Instead of showing it as 1 lakh rupees in the invoice. Now I want you to visualize this. This is in the document that the taxpayer has issued, that is Rajesh or Rajesh assistant has issued. He has shown a value of 10 lakh rupees instead of 1 lakh rupees. Now if I were to say it is actually 18% tax, it means that the tax amount would be 18,000 rupees. Now instead of showing 18,000, he has shown it as 1.8 lakh rupees. He has shown it as 1.8 lakh rupees. Now, it could also be possible that the person who has actually issued the invoice here, instead of 1 lakh rupees, he actually showed it as 10,000 rupees. Person can make a mistake in the document, very much possible. As I said, I'm just trying to build only on the awareness that we are having. Now, after I issue an invoice, the value of the invoice that is there could be actually more than what is the actual value, or it could be less than the value that is actually to be reflected in the invoice. So two scenarios, 10 lakhs and 10,000. Now what is the tax that he will show here? It will be shown as 1.8k. The invoice has been issued on 1/4/2025. Neither Rajesh nor his assistant, whoever issued the invoice, notices it, nor the recipient Chandrakant notices it for, say, let us say 3 months. And suddenly in June, either through an audit here or Chandrakant finds out that the invoice itself is actually showing 10 lakh rupees instead of 1 lakh, or it is 10,000 rupees instead of 1 lakh rupees. Now Chandrakant points out and says that there is a mistake, and that is the value or the tax that is shown in the invoice is either more or less. A scenario happens where the taxable value or the tax shown in the invoice is either more or it is less. So you have two scenarios here where the value shown in the invoice is more, where the value shown in the invoice is less. The tax shown in the invoice is more, or the tax shown in the invoice is less. Now, is there a document that is provided in GST which allows Rajesh to correct that particular mistake? Yes, very much so. Now, in a scenario, I'm just going to erase this. In a scenario where after the issue of an invoice, now you have to visualize this. After the issue of an invoice that is there, it so happens that it is noticed that the taxable value or the tax shown is more. That is, it is shown as 10 lakh rupees instead of 1 lakh. Or it could be the second scenario where the taxable value or the tax shown is less, which means that instead of 1 lakh rupees, is shown it as 10,000 rupees. And what is the document that is provided in the GST Act, the CGST Act, which can actually correct this particular mistake is, in this scenario where the taxable value or the tax shown is more, Section 34, read with Rule 53. Read with Rule 53 provides that Rajesh can issue a credit note. Rajesh can issue a credit note in a circumstance where the taxable value or the tax shown is more. Similarly, in the same one, Section 34 and Rule 53, if the value shown by Rajesh in his invoice or Rajesh's assistant in his invoice, if the value shown is less, Rajesh can issue a debit note to rectify this mistake. Now, what is the value of the debit note or the credit note that Rajesh needs to issue? That we need to understand. In respect of where the value shown with reference to the example 1 lakh, 10 lakh, Rajesh issues a credit note for 9 lakh rupees. Issues a credit note for 9 lakh rupees, and the tax amount he Now, once you've understood this credit note or debit note, I told you that credit note or debit note is issued in a circumstance where the taxable value or the tax shown is more or less. Is there any other circumstance in which you can issue a credit note or a debit note? Very much possible. In respect of debit note, there are no other circumstances. In Section 34 provides for issue of no other circumstances is provided under Section 34 for issuing of a debit note. Whereas with reference to a credit note, there are two other situations in which a credit note can be issued by the supplier. What are the other circumstances? The first circumstance is the taxable value or the tax shown is more. The second circumstance is the goods or the services are returned. That is, the supply of 100 numbers of this pen to Chandrakant has been returned by Chandrakant back to Rajesh. In this circumstance, Rajesh can issue a credit note. Now, to what value will Rajesh issue a credit note now? In respect, now we assume that the invoice value that is shown is correct. Now, Rajesh will issue a credit note for 1 lakh rupees. 1 lakh rupees, 18,000 rupees is the tax amount. Rajesh will issue a credit note for that. I am talking in this circumstance, the invoice value shown itself is correct. The goods sent by Rajesh to Chandrakant has been returned back by Chandrakant. In this circumstance, Rajesh can issue a credit note for 1 lakh rupees and the tax is 18,000 rupees. What is the impact of this credit note on Rajesh's liability? It reduces by 18,000 rupees. What is the impact of the input tax credit in respect of Chandrakant? It has to reduce, or Chandrakant has to reverse or reduce 18,000 rupees from his input tax credit balance. Is there another circumstance in which Rajesh can issue a credit note? Yes, the last circumstance is if the goods or the services are found to be deficient. Now, visualize this scenario. It is found to be deficient in quantity. It could be found to be deficient in quality also. Now, look at this. What does it mean? It is found to be deficient in quantity. Rajesh has raised an invoice for 100 numbers of this pen. Correct? But whereas Chandrakant has actually received only 90 numbers. Chandrakant has received only 90 numbers, or Chandrakant has received only 50 numbers. Now, Chandrakant, will he make the payment for me with reference to the full amount? No. Is Chandrakant eligible to take the credit with reference to the entire 100 numbers? No, because he's received only 50 or 90. So, in a circumstance where the quantity or the quality of the goods or the services are found to be deficient, in this particular circumstance also a credit note can be issued. If you were to take an example, if I were to give you an example for this, if it is found to be deficient in quantity, what do you mean? 100 numbers of this pen has been supplied. 100 numbers is actually but the supply was actually 50 numbers. Now, to the extent of the 50 numbers which were not supplied, Rajesh can issue a credit note, and Rajesh's liability in that particular tax period will reduce by 9,000. Chandrakant's input tax credit will reduce by 9,000. I may be taking a little more time just to try to make you understand this concept, but I'm sure that with these examples in mind, what you will understand is that if I were to remove all these particular circumstances that is there, this example that is there, we are talking about the documents that are there in GST. When we talk about the documents that are there in GST, what you can make out from this is, I told you that the first document is an invoice. If after issue of an invoice, the taxable value or the tax shown is more, goods services are returned, goods services are found to be deficient, the document to be issued is a credit note. If the taxable value or the tax shown is actually less, if it is less, the document that can be issued is a debit note. The respective provision of the law under the CGST Act also I have highlighted there. So in case you have any doubts, you'll always go back to the respective provision with reference to credit note, debit note, section 34 of the CGST Act, rule 53(1)A, I think it is, of the CGST rules. So now we have come to 3 documents that we understood based on the concept of time of supply. Now you have a time of supply that is there, you have the date of issue of invoice, the invoice, credit note and a debit note. Now let me give you another scenario that is there. Let me make you understand this with another scenario. The next scenario that I am going to try to tell you is, it so happens that Rajesh, at the time of issuing the invoice, I told you in the invoice, if the taxable value or the tax shown is wrong, he can issue a credit note or a debit note. But in invoice itself, rule 46 tells you that there are various details that needs to be captured or which needs to be reflected in an invoice. In the invoice that Rajesh has issued, in addition, there is no mistake with reference to taxable value or the tax. Now Rajesh is a person registered under GST, that is, he is a registered taxpayer. Now Rajesh, it so happens that issues a registered person. A registered person has issued an invoice. Now in the invoice, there is no mistake with reference to the taxable value or the tax shown. There is no mistake. But it so happens that Rajesh was supposed to show the HSN details, or Rajesh has made the supply of 100 numbers, but in the invoice he showed it incorrectly as 50 numbers. Could be possible? It's a mistake. In the invoice that I have issued, I can make any mistake, which is possible. Now I have to now see whether with reference to that mistake that I have made, can I correct it? Now I am a registered person, I have issued an invoice and I noticed that there is a circumstance in which there is certain errors that are made in the invoice that I have issued. Now the question that arises is, the question that needs to be answered now is, can an invoice issued by a registered person be revised? Can an invoice issued by a registered person, can it be revised? You need to answer that question. Now, let me tell you, first of all, there is no provision in the law which permits a registered person to revise an invoice already issued. There is no provision in the law which permits the registered person to revise an invoice. But in GST, as per section 31(3)A, section 31(3)A, there is a concept which is called as revised invoice. There is a concept, or there is a document that is provided under GST law, section 31(3)A, which says there is revised invoice. 31(3)A read with rule 53(2). Section 31(3)A read with rule 53(2) says that there is a possibility of a revised invoice. Now you have to visualize this. What I am trying to make you understand is, an invoice issued by a registered person cannot be revised. Now then you need to answer the question as to what is the circumstance for issue of a revised invoice provided under section 31(3)A read with rule 53(2). Now what is the provision that permits the issue of a revised invoice? Let me give you a scenario like this. Now the threshold limit for taking a registration, again I don't have an audience so I cannot ask you a question, I am just making a statement. The threshold limit for issue of an invoice, the threshold limit for taking a registration in respect of goods is when I cross 40 lakh rupees, and for services it is 20 lakh rupees. If it is 40 lakhs for goods and it is 20 lakh for services. When do I need to apply for registration? I need to apply for the registration 30 days before I cross this 40 lakhs or 20 lakhs. I have to make that judgment and say 30 days before this particular date, I am going to cross 40 lakh rupees. 30 days before this particular date, I am going to cross 20 lakh rupees and I need to apply for a registration. Let me throw up a couple of scenarios. Let me give you a particular example for this. In this particular circumstance, it so happens that now Rajesh is a supplier of this pen, and let us say that Rajesh is making supply of goods, pen. Okay, so my 40 lakh rupees I will be crossing, let us say, on 1/10/2025, 1/10/2024. So 30 days before that, I know that I am going to cross. That means, I am going to be 40 lakh rupees on this It doesn't mean that it has to be accurate or anything like that. I have to make a judgment on that call. I'm just giving you an example to make you understand that 1/10/2024, I know that I'm going to cross 40 lakh rupees. So now I need to apply for a registration somewhere on 1/9/2024. So I need to apply for a registration on this particular circumstance. Now, instead of applying on 1/9, what I do is I apply for the registration on 21/9/2024. Very much possible. The law says within 30 days I should, but I have now actually become aware of it. I apply for registration on 21/9/2024. Now, when I did this, my actually value of this, my turnover at that particular point in time was 39 lakh rupees. I'm giving you a scenario to make you understand in what circumstance a revised invoice can be issued. Now, 21/9, my turnover is 39 lakhs. I apply for a registration on 21/9/2024. On 1/10/2024, I cross 40 lakh rupees, and on 10/10/2024, I am granted a registration. And my registration here on this particular date, by the time I get my registration on 10/10/2024, my turnover has become 42 lakh rupees. That is, from the period after 1/10, when I crossed 40 lakh rupees. Okay, the 40 lakh rupees, which is the threshold limit, I get my registration only after 10 days after I've crossed it. Now visualize the repercussions or the impact of this particular situation. What is possible in this? In this particular scenario now, in this one, Rajesh is a person who has applied for the registration on 1/10/2024. He has crossed 40 lakhs. He has applied on 21/9/2024, sorry. He has crossed 40 lakhs on 1/10/2024. During this intervening period, let us say that Rajesh has made supplies to Chandrakant, and he has also made supplies to, say, let us say, another friend of mine, Mahesh. He has made a supply. So he has made a supply of 1 lakh rupees. 1 lakh rupees. 2 invoices is generated. 1 lakh rupees. 1 lakh rupees is generated. 1 invoice to Chandrakant, 1 invoice to Mahesh. Now visualize this particular scenario. At the time of issue of that means before 10/10, he's made the supply. That is, before 9/10, before he got his registration, he's made the supply. Now visualize this particular scenario. Does Rajesh have a GSTN for this? No, because Rajesh gets his GSTN only on 10/10. Correct? Now look at it from the next perspective that is there. Now, will the department allow Rajesh to not pay his liability in respect of this 2 lakhs? No. Rajesh has to pay his liability with reference to the 2 lakh rupees. Perfect. Sir, now come to the scenario with reference to Chandrakant and to Mahesh. Is Chandrakant or Mahesh eligible for the input tax credit in respect of the supply? Or will Chandrakant, now on one hand, Rajesh has to pay the liability in respect of this 2 lakh rupees. On the next hand, Chandrakant and Mahesh are not eligible for the input tax credit with reference to the tax amount because there is no GSTN for it, and Rajesh is not able to show it in his GSTR1. Correct? Now, in this circumstance, 31(3)(a) or Rule 53(2) provides a mechanism for a person to revise his invoice issued between the effective date of registration and the date of actual registration certificate. That is, if this is the effective date of registration, till the actual date of registration certificate, whatever document, whatever invoice has been issued, 31(3)(a) provides that Rajesh can revise the invoices with reference to this particular 2 supplies, issue a revised invoice. In respect of the condition is, the revised invoice should be issued, I think, within 30 days from the actual date of supply. And if you remember when I told you about, when I was talking to you about GSTR1, I told you that there is a concept of first return. The first return as per section 40. All revised invoices that have been issued between the effective date of registration till the actual date of, that is the date of when he gets the registration certificate, all invoices that have been issued can be revised, and those revised invoices are shown in the first GSTR1. Now, by showing the revised invoice details in the first return or the first GSTR1 filed by Rajesh, it is possible to reflect these details pertaining to Chandrakant and Mahesh, and Chandrakant and Mahesh will get their 2A and 2B auto-populated and then thus be eligible for input tax credit subject to the conditions that have been provided. So now here is where I want you to understand that there is a possibility, or the law provides for what is called as a revised invoice. A revised invoice, not in a scenario where the invoice has been issued by a registered person. Revised invoice issued by a person between the effective date of registration till the actual date of his registration certificate. So there, now in addition, now you have the next document that is there, which is called as now invoice, credit note, debit note, and you had the next document that is there, which is actually a revised invoice. You have a revised invoice that is there. Now that is 31(3)(a). Come to the next circumstance that is there, which is called as, which is not a very significant document. I just want to briefly touch upon that. It is called as a bill of supply. A bill of supply is again provided under section 31(3)(b). You have A for a revised invoice, B for, you have a B 31(3)(b) for bill of supply. A bill of supply is issued by a composition levy person. It is also very much possible that a registered person makes supplies which are exempted. Under this particular circumstance, it is possible for him, if he chooses to, he can issue a bill of supply. 31(3)(c) tells you that if it is within 200 rupees, he need not issue a bill of supply, something like that is there. That is 31(3)(c). Now, with reference to the invoice that is there in place, you have a credit note, you have a debit note, and there is a possibility of a revised invoice. You have these documents. We are talking about the documents that are there in GST, and I am using the concept of time of supply with reference to services where the invoice is issued within the specified date to make you understand the various documents that are there. Now go back to the example, or you will have to recall the example that I keep telling you also. The example that I told you in that one was, there was this particular scenario I said was, the invoice was dated 1/4/2025. The invoice was 1/4/2025 for 1 lakh rupees. The advance was 28/2/2025 for 50,000 rupees. Correct? This, if you recall, this was the example that I told you. These are the circumstances in which there is an invoice that can be issued. Now, in this invoice that is there 1/4/2025 1 lakh rupees and advance received on 28/2/2025. In respect of the advance that Rajesh received of 50,000 rupees, in respect of the advance that Rajesh received in respect of this 50,000 rupees, does GST law require that a document be issued? Yes. In respect of this advances, that Rajesh receives, 50,000 rupees that Rajesh has received, in respect of this advances, Rajesh needs to issue a document which is provided under section 31(3)(d), and it is rule 50. And the document that Rajesh needs to issue is what is called as a receipt voucher. Rajesh needs to issue what is called as a receipt voucher. Now, what is the receipt voucher that will be issued for? The receipt voucher will be issued for 50,000 rupees. Now, I want you to think. Rajesh receives an advance of 50,000 rupees. After Rajesh receives an advance of 50,000 rupees, what are the possibilities in respect of the supply? Can I say that now in the example that I gave you, what did I tell you? Rajesh makes the supply on 1/4/2025. Rajesh makes the supply on 1/4/2025. Rajesh issues a receipt voucher on 28/2 or in the month of February for 50,000 rupees. Rajesh makes the supply in respect of this advance received on 1/4/2025, and when Rajesh makes a supply, Rajesh has to go back and issue an invoice. Perfectly fine. There is no problem in that. Again, I told you with reference to time of supply of services, Rajesh should have paid his tax liability at the time when receipt voucher was issued. So Rajesh would have paid his liability in the month of February with reference to 50,000 rupees. Is it possible that Rajesh or any other taxpayer, after receipt of the advance, does not make a supply? I want you to pause and think. It's very much possible that Rajesh, after receiving the 50,000 rupees, he makes the supply or he does not make a supply. He does not make a supply. Very common thing that can happen to us, that is, we go and book an apartment. We book an apartment for 10,000, paying 10% of this one, and then we decide we don't want that apartment. We say, in respect of that, this one, what happens? The apartment, the service provider actually has paid his liability in respect of the 10% advance that is received. Receipt voucher was issued. Now, in respect of no supply happening, that is, there is no supply happening because, Rajesh has withdrawn his application or whatever it is, he doesn't want to continue with that one, or for any other circumstance in which the supplier, after receiving the advance, does not make a supply. Whenever, after receipt of an advance, if there is no supply happening, a document needs to be issued under provision which is called as 31(3)(e) Rule 51, and the document is called as refund voucher. So, there is a supply. In case after receipt of the advance, if there is a supply, the supply, in respect of the supply, an invoice is issued. In respect of no supply, a refund voucher is issued. I think we are clear till now when we are talking about the documents that are there. I'm sure that you will remember it in this order rather than thinking that it is invoice, refund voucher, receipt voucher, credit note, debit note. Instead of looking at it from that perspective, you will now actually look at it from this particular perspective, that there is invoice, credit note, debit note, revised invoice, payment, receipt voucher for advance receipt, receipt voucher for an advance receipt. After the advance is received, if the supply happens, it issues an invoice. If there is no supply happening, there is a refund voucher. I think till here we are now clear. Now here I go back into this particular scenario. Now there is a concept I'm sure that all of us are familiar with. There is one part where the supplier pays the tax. There are certain circumstances in which the recipient needs to pay taxes. The recipient needs to pay taxes, and it is provided under section 9.3 and 9.4. I'm just going to explain that a little more detail a little later. But there is what is a concept which is called as a reverse charge mechanism. It's called as RCM. In respect, now visualize this particular example that was in place. The example that was in place was Rajesh made the supply to Chandrakant. After Rajesh makes a supply to Chandrakant, in respect of this particular supply, in the normal course, Rajesh should have paid the liability. Because it is covered under reverse charge, now Chandrakant has to pay the liability. Correct? Now, in respect of this reverse charge, there are two possibilities. One is under reverse charge, in respect of 9.3, it is in respect of specified goods or services. There is a notification which tells, in respect of this goods, this services, the recipient needs to pay tax. Whenever there is a supply from one person to the recipient, if it is specified under this particular notification for goods or services, the recipient needs to pay tax. That is specified goods or services. It is also possible that if these goods or services is received from an unregistered person. That means, let's give this particular example. Rajesh now in this example is an unregistered person. Rajesh is an unregistered person. Chandrakant has received this particular goods or services, and if it is covered under the notification issued under 9.4, Chandrakant has to pay the liability in respect of this specified. Here in this one is non-registered person, unregistered person. We are talking about the documents that are there. There is last one set of document that is possible is that there is a concept which is called as reverse charge. In the reverse charge, it is provided under section 9.3 and 9.4. I will touch upon a little more detail with reference to 9.3 and 9.4 as I explain one more concept to you. But time being, let us understand this. In a scenario where Rajesh makes a supply to Chandrakant, and if there are certain specified goods or services which are provided by a notification issued under section 9.3, that is, in respect of specified goods or services which is issued under notification issued under section 9.3, Chandrakant needs to pay his liability, which is called as reverse charge. Now, similarly, in respect of it is very much possible that Rajesh is an unregistered person and he makes a supply to Chandrakant. Now, if there is a notification which specifies that supplies received from an unregistered person, the recipient needs to pay tax under reverse charge provided under section 9.4. In respect of these reverse charge supplies, is there a document that needs to be issued? Now, because I'm talking only about the documents, that is all that we are focused upon. We are not going beyond that as well. Now, what is the document that needs to be issued in respect of specified goods or services in respect of which the recipient needs to pay the taxes? In respect of this specified goods or services in respect of which the recipient needs to pay taxes, which is provided under this 9(3). Now, the recipient, when he makes the payment to the supplier, he needs to issue a document which is called as a payment voucher. There is a payment voucher that needs to be issued. Now 31(3)D, 31(3)E. Now in this is done as per the provision, I think, which is 31(3)G. 31(3)G, that is reverse charge supplies in respect of specified goods and or services. Okay. The document that needs to be issued is payment voucher 31(3)G, and if it is 5051, this will be Rule 52. This is Rule 52. Now, it so happens that Rajesh is an unregistered person. In respect of supplies from an unregistered person, which are notified based on the notification issued under Section 9(4), in respect of this particular type of supply, in respect of this particular one, Chandrakant needs to issue a self-generated invoice. That means the recipient needs to issue a self-generated invoice, and this is provided under the provision 31(3)F. 31(3)F. So now we have more or less covered the documents that are there in GST based on only two concepts that is there. In addition to this, there are a couple of other documents that is there. There is what is called as an ISD invoice. Since we are talking about a normal taxpayer, a special invoice what is issued by an ISD person. In this particular one, I am not going to focus too much on that. There is a last document which is called as a delivery challan. Wherever there is no supply involved or whatever is provided under Rule 55 or the CGST rules, a delivery challan has to be issued. What was the focus that we tried to achieve in this particular discussion was try to understand the various documents that are there in GST. Which are the various documents? Invoice, credit, after issue of an invoice, if the taxable value or the tax shown is more, goods or services are returned, goods or services are found to be deficient, a credit note can be issued. If the taxable value or the tax shown is less, that is the taxable value or the tax shown in the invoice is less, a document that can be issued to rectify that mistake is a debit note. There is a concept of revised invoice. The revised invoice pertains to only that period between the effective date of registration and the actual date of registration certificate. Any invoices that have been issued during this particular period, a revised invoice can be issued. A revised invoice gets reflected in the first return, which is provided under Section 40 of the CGST Act. Okay, that is with reference to the first limb of the time of supply, which is invoice. When it comes to the payment part, there are two possibilities that are there. An advance is received. When an advance is received, a receipt voucher gets issued. Once a receipt voucher is issued, there is a possibility that supply happens, or it is also possible that there is no supply happening. When a supply happens, invoice is issued, or no supply happens, a document that is issued is a refund voucher. In addition to that, we have what is called as a bill of supply, which is issued by a composition levy person or a normal taxpayer when he makes a supply of exempted goods or services. Reverse charge, in respect of reverse charge supplies, when the reverse charge pertains to specified goods or let's say notified goods or services from a registered person, a payment voucher needs to be issued. If it is with reference to supplies received from an unregistered person, reverse charge, a self-generated invoice needs to be issued. The addition invoice, there is what is called as an ISD invoice and a delivery challan. Now, these are the documents that are there in GST. What did I tell you is actually reflecting in the GSTR1? What is actually reflecting in the GSTR1 is the data pertaining to these documents that have been issued during a particular tax period. And the data pertaining to these documents, is there a logic which we can say that can be reflected in the GSTR1 is the next part of today's session. Okay?
In the next segment, Shri Rajesh V. George will take you through the GSTR1 return, exploring its structure, key components, and the data flow involved in its filing.